Yes, by now it has been more than 30 years since the Kawasaki ZX-6R was presented for the very first time. That is a long time. A great deal has happened and a lot of development has taken place. I think that is reason enough for us to take another closer look at the current bike. We want to see what has happened over the years in terms of development and how it performs on the racetrack. We will also look back a little into its history because I was able to accompany some of that development myself. There are some interesting facts here, so stay with us. Yes, back in my early days, around 1995, when Kawasaki presented it for the first time, it had 105 PS, and it was the spearhead from the green camp in the Supersport class, which was extremely hard fought at the time. Kawasaki, just like the other manufacturers, naturally put a huge amount of energy into this class. Back then, the Supersport class was, in a way, the highlight alongside the superbikes. The aim was to show that in terms of technology, you could absolutely play right at the very front. The 600s were extremely popular back then. Today, that is no longer quite the case. That also has a little to do with the fact that at that time, with the 600, you could achieve a kind of riding dynamics that simply could not be achieved with the bigger capacities. The weight was just too high, the engine and the overall dimensions were too large to make the same handling possible. With those 105 PS that it initially had in 1995, it was not far away from the large capacity bikes in terms of peak power. But because of the narrow construction and the low weight, the riding dynamics you got were really something special. That was the reason why the 600s back then were basically the class that everybody fought over, because everyone wanted to be right at the front. The Supersport World Championship was packed at that time. There were more than 40 starters on the grid, and that is why every manufacturer tried to put something proper on its wheels. Over the years, all of that changed a little. Slowly, a lot of development also went into the larger capacities. In terms of specific power output, the big bikes were clearly behind the 600s. If we are talking about 105 PS from 600 cubic centimeters, then a Fireblade, for example, did not have much more than 120 or 130 PS in its first generations. So after the Supersport segment had already been well supplied, manufacturers gradually started to catch up there as well and made the superbikes and the larger capacity bikes more and more performance-oriented. They also began to realize a specific power output similar to that of the 600s. That is why the class changed a little as well. Kawasaki then chose the route of using a slightly larger capacity. In 2002, they increased the engine from 600 cubic centimeters to the 636 that we still have today, so that a little more power would already be available from lower revs. The original engines were designed in such a way that you could call up a lot, especially in terms of peak power. However, that did take something away from the performance at low revs. That is why Kawasaki chose the path of installing a little more capacity. Over the years, they stepped back from that a little. They took the 636 out of circulation again, but a few years later they saw that this had in fact been the right way and brought it back onto the market. The 600 continued in parallel for a while because it was still needed for the Supersport class due to the regulations. You were not allowed to line up with more than 600 cubic centimeters there, and that is why those two parallel versions existed. Today, the Supersport class is set up completely differently. The regulations are open and you are no longer restricted in the same way by capacity. That is why we now have the 636 standing here in front of us on its own without a 600 cubic centimeter counterpart. For me, it is always quite nice to look back a little within the green camp. Especially with the ZX6, I was also able to accompany its development over the years. For several years, I was part of the development team with the Japanese engineers. That is why I can speak a little from first-hand experience here. Today, if we slowly come back to the data of the current bike, we have 124 PS from 636 cubic centimeters. That is at around 13,000 revs. It is 129 PS when you also take the ram air into account. Nowadays, we have a completely different design philosophy for the motorcycle. The ergonomics have changed massively compared with earlier times. In the first version in 1995, it was still a somewhat longer motorcycle. Even as a taller rider, you found quite a lot of room. If you look more closely at the ergonomics today, you see that the whole thing has become ultra compact. I will just sit on it briefly. I am not exactly one of the really tall riders, but at 1.80 m, I am certainly not among the very small riders either. When we look at the ergonomics here now, you can see straight away that it is very compact. The distance between the seat and the handlebar, especially to the clip-ons, has also become very short and very tight. From my point of view, that is also a bit of a drawback with this bike, especially on the racetrack. When I sit here, you can already see that the knee angle is also more on the tight side. And if you look at it, when I now reach for the handlebar, then in order to get into a good position here, I always come into conflict with my knee and my elbow. Even when I'm riding on the road and start to turn the bars here, the handlebar is already almost touching my knee. That is the point I do not like quite so much. Of course, it depends a little on body size and on the length of your limbs, but compared with other bikes, it is something that immediately catches your eye. The extreme angle of the clip-ons here is also partly responsible for that. They are swept very far back and they are also very low. And that is why we come extremely close to the knee, the feet and the legs here. That would be something where I would wish for a bit of a change, especially on the racetrack. You have to fight with a huge amount of energy that you need in order to position the bike accordingly. If you imagine that you had a little more distance to the handlebar and could grip it more from behind, you would have much more force that you could feed in to tip the motorcycle very quickly into the corner. Since we are already talking about ergonomics, you also notice quite quickly the very small front end. By small, I mean that it sits very low and offers very little wind protection from the front. That makes it all the more important that you can tuck into an aerodynamically favorable position close to the tank. And then precisely this issue becomes even more obvious. That is where I would simply wish for a slightly different seating ergonomics. So the triangle between the footrests, the seat and the clip-ons is simply much too tight here. The good thing, however, is that for racetrack use, it can be adjusted relatively easily. If you fit different clip-ons here, ones that are swept a little further forward and perhaps not quite as low but left a little higher, then the situation automatically becomes more relaxed. In combination with a different footrest system, perhaps one that is a touch lower, we have actually already solved the main problem. Perhaps next we should take a look at the engine straight away. We said it has 636 cubic centimeters, so of course it has a certain capacity advantage compared with the other 600s. That also helps to provide a little more punch and power at lower revs. For me though, it is still a proper Supersports motorcycle and it still needs a certain amount of revs. If you really want to call up performance, then we definitely have to use at least 9,000 to 10,000 revs so that we have really strong drive here. That drive then stays with us until just before the rev limiter, which then takes the power away gently. You always have a good feeling for where you have to place the shift point in order to keep a good connection to the next gear. What generally stands out extremely positively about the engine is its smoothness. When you start the bike, the engine runs so roundly that there are no vibrations in it. At times you hardly even notice that the engine is already running. Thanks to Euro 5 Plus, which by now brings very strict restrictions with it, you really have the feeling here of an electric motor, one that works from low down all the way up, without major vibrations and with very good controllability. The gearbox on the motorcycle works really exquisitely well. The gear changes are already incredibly soft in purely mechanical terms, in combination with the quickshifter, which is only intended for upshifts, and we will come back to that later. The changes work incredibly precisely and very, very easily. On the racetrack, that is a lot of fun because, of course, a great many gear changes are necessary there. Together with the extremely light clutch that we find on this bike, which can be operated with one finger, this gives the motorcycle itself ultra-light handling. The very compact geometry of the bike also creates very easy handling. With slightly better ergonomics, we would have an even easier time here, but even as it stands, the bike can be placed very easily into position and into lean angle. We already mentioned the quickshifter in only one direction. That is mainly because if we talk about the electronics, this bike does not yet have a ride-by-wire system implemented. That is necessary in order to make a blipper solution possible so that you can also downshift with the quickshifter. For that, I need this ride-by-wire function so that the ECU can give throttle blips independently of the twist grip in order to carry out the downshift. The rider aids are naturally also a little more restrained because of the slightly older electronics that we have in here. There are not yet that many adjustment options. We have 3 predefined riding modes and 1 custom mode, which you can then set up a little yourself. But I have to say, that does not stand out in a negative way at all, because the rider aids do not have all that much to do here. The engine is so soft and so easy to operate well and quickly that you do not miss ride-by-wire here. And the riding modes we do have cover everything you need on this bike. I did not need the custom mode at all. Sport mode was already so well set up that it did not hold me back excessively anywhere. That is always an important point as well, that we have a kind of traction control available here. But it is not one that costs lap time and performance. It really only intervenes where it should. And in that respect, the electronics cover things very well indeed. The display is of course also of a slightly older design, but it is still easy to read. We have all the information we need. When we talk about electronics, we should perhaps also mention the ABS. We do have ABS on board here, but unfortunately it cannot be deactivated separately for the racetrack. In particular, being able to deactivate the ABS at the rear wheel helps enormously in order to realize more braking performance in dry conditions, especially on the racetrack. That is something I would definitely still wish for on this bike, because it raises the performance once again. I then tried to deactivate it by another route, and then you can see that a little more performance is simply available here. So it would be nice if in future we also had a switchable rear wheel ABS available. Apart from the ABS control function, however, the brake is incredibly good and reliable. We hardly have any fading of the pressure point. There is a very good feeling, and the deceleration is absolutely fine as well. Even though we were doing many laps here on the racetrack, and even though we were pushing very hard, we were not able to bring the brake to its limit. That already shows that the basic layout of the brake is absolutely okay. If the ABS function here were correspondingly deactivatable, then we would have absolute top-level performance. Yes, so you can see that Kawasaki has allowed a great deal of development to flow in over more than 30 years. We have a super smooth running engine, even though we do not have ride-by-wire. Nevertheless, the response is very soft, it is easy to dose and easy to control. The rider aids that are included are absolutely sufficient to cause a proper stir and have real fun on the racetrack as well. They do not hold you back too strongly. If you adapt the ergonomics on the bike a little, which is probably a bit restrictive, especially for taller riders, and perhaps fit a larger bubble screen at the front, then nothing stands in the way of truly enjoyable use on the racetrack. The performance and the precision of the bike are really excellent. The feedback from the suspension is also well done. Although it brings a lot of comfort with it and is absolutely suitable for road use, it does not show extreme movement or a tendency to pump on the racetrack. You remain genuinely calm and precise at all times. So it is really very well suited even for a beginner to build up a lot of confidence here. And with that, I have to say, it reminds me very nicely of my early days when the Kawasaki ZX-6R was the first bike from the green faction to cause a real stir in this class as well. Kawasaki oriented itself around what existed in those days and refined everything everywhere. That has had a really positive effect. That is why I have to say it was fun for me to turn laps here today at the Slovakiaring. If you get the opportunity, try it sometime. It is still a top bike. Perhaps in the near future, we will also see another update where a new generation of electronics then also finds its way in here. That would be nice. I would be pleased if the green team continued to hold on to the 600 class. It is still a sought-after class. I hope I have been able to give you a few interesting pieces of information about the ZX-6R, and I would be happy if we see each other again next time at one of our tests on 1000 PS. Bye and baba.